The Book Review Podcast has been around for almost 14 years, and we would love to hear your feedback. Let us know what you think by joining our panel at nytimes.com/thebookreview. Thanks so much. How does Michelle Obama's personal story fit into the larger tapestry of America's Great Migration? Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns, joins us to talk about Obama's memoir, Becoming. What does an internet novel look like? Helen Schulman will be here to discuss her latest book, Come With Me. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Isabel Wilkerson joins us now. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. And this week, she reviews Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming. Isabel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This is a daunting book to take on because you're writing about a woman that many Americans, many readers worldwide think they know, but probably don't really know. But probably have some kind of impression of. How did you approach this book and the review?
Well, one thing that I did was I tried not to pay attention to the onslaught of information about this book. I tried to isolate myself as much as I could. And then I read it deeply twice. Really, I read it, you could say, 2.5 times. It's 428 pages, and the version I had was 428 loose pages, so heaven forbid if you drop them, and then it takes half an hour to put them back together again. So I really approached it, tried to approach it with an open mind as if I did not know her, and to hear what she had to say.
I want to focus in a bit really on her early years, and that's what you focus your review on. But before we get there, just talking about sort of what people come to this book with, I think that the impression that I had among many people who were eager to read the book was based on those frames, those still shots that we have of her where it looks like there is a lot going on in her mind right now that she is not articulating, and that when I read this book, finally, we'll get to know, what does Michelle Obama really think? What did she think when this happened or that happened? Does the book give you that?
The strength of this book is that she basically takes you by the hand on this tour of working-class African-American life. And that's the first third where we're getting to see her in this attic apartment on the south side of Chicago, a bungalow that's owned by her prim great aunt and her fastidious husband. And you get to see the striving and the dreaming and the ambitions of people who are not where they are hoping to be. They're in this space where they're trying to push forward, and her parents put everything they had into her and to her brother. And I think that aspect of her, we might have known the outlines of it because I think many people knew that she was from Chicago. They knew she was from South Shore. We knew the basics, that she'd gone to Princeton and then to Harvard Law, that she worked at this high-powered law firm in Chicago where she met the man who would become her husband. The outlines, when you asked me what did I think of her before, that basic story we knew. So we had the outline of it. But we didn't know, how did it feel to be in those spaces? What was that march toward where she ultimately arrived? What was that like for her? How did she make the decisions that would lead her to her ultimate arrival at the White House? I think those are the kinds of things that we simply did not know until she began to speak. Of course, there have been many things written about her, but we never had the chance to hear from her directly. The position that she'd been in meant that she was, by definition, guarded, at a reserve, somewhat distant from our ability to really truly understand what it's like to be inside her world and inside her mind and heart. And this gives us a chance to see what she's really like.
I think what people wanted to know is, to some extent, and this was probably what a lot of the very early reviews focused on, the years of Barack's presidency and the post-presidency and our current president, and sort of what did Michelle make of all that really, beyond what she said publicly and has, at the time and since. And in that respect, is she cautious in this book or is she open?
It's hard to really know on some level because we only know what she's written, and there could be things that she chose not to say in this book. I think that the thread that goes throughout the discussion about the politics is that she was so uninterested and not especially wanting to have a political life. I mean, she says over and over and over again that she wanted to have the kind of the grounded family life that she had grown up with. She wanted the order and the consistency of being together as a family, and that his decision to first run for state senator in Illinois, was the beginning of the chiseling away at what her initial dream had been. And so it's very clear that each step of the way, each decision that he's making, every new position that he's running for, is met with resistance by her. And in fact, at one point, when he was about to run for president, actually, or was considering it, she says that, he talked to everybody but one person, and that was her, because he kind of knew that she would not be in favor of it or be resistant to it. You mentioned, was she fully open with this? I think that she makes it very clear that she had many, many reservations about his running. But now that she's been on the book tour, she has been even more open and speaking about her concerns, her fears. And actually, she said in London that she actually went along with it because she didn't think he was going to win. So she felt that, if I say, go ahead and run, I'm paraphrasing, I would be scoring points as the supportive spouse. I would have allowed him to continue to go on. Then he won't win, and then everything that would be her plan. And that's what she said on the road. It's not quite as frank in the book. It comes through, but while she's been on the road, I think she's been expanding on just how strongly she felt about the world of politics, how little she actually thought of politics.
To what extent did her desire for that more grounded existence stem from her own childhood experience?
It appears as if it comes from the foundation that she was able to get from these two devoted parents and the stable community that she had grown up in, a community that, frankly, many Americans, don't really have a sense of because of the way these neighborhoods are often presented in the news. But I got the sense that not only was it her family's solidity, but it also was her own personality. She describes herself as a box checker. She describes herself as someone who always has a plan, is thinking ahead about how things are to be, orderly and organized individual. And so I think that the idea of having order and having grounding personally and in your family is just an important part of her. It's interesting that that we refer in the review and also in the book. She says that, interestingly enough, as resistant as she had been to the march of politics that was sort of taking over her life and her family, it was only when they got to the White House that actually she had kind of that ability to have the order and organization and the closeness of the family because they lived on top of the office. They lived in the same building as his office, and so she could have the regular dinners with her entire family together. And so I think that this actually is not just her family's experience, but also you get a sense that this is important to her personally.
How conscious is she of history and of her sort of place in this larger tapestry?
That's kind of interesting because she's writing from the perspective of how it felt to be her growing up, becoming a young lawyer, meeting the man who would become her husband, and then the journey that they would ultimately get on to get here to the point where they are now. And there are references to such things as the Great Migration, which is how her family came to Chicago. She came through two different streams of the Great Migration. On her father's side, her paternal side, they came from South Carolina to Chicago. And on her maternal side, they came from Georgia and Alabama to Chicago, where her mother and father were descendant from people who had come from those two different streams. They would never have met had there been no Great Migration, which is really, the story of most African Americans in this country, but also the story of most Americans who descend from multiple streams from all over the world to get to this soil. And so she makes reference to that. She puts herself in the context of that larger story. In working on the review, though, I wanted to sit with the idea of the word lady. I really wanted to parse that word and to think about what that meant in our country's history, to whom that word was applied and to whom it was not applied. And so that became the frame for me to get into the story of her life and to be able to put her life in context. Because this is truly extraordinary when you step back and think about nearly 400 years of African Americans being on this soil. And for the vast majority of that time, the word lady was literally not used for African Americans. Literally, African American women were called women versus in the South, they were called, white women were called white ladies. So they made a big distinction about who deserved that title. And that was one of the things I wanted to sit with, and that was the context in which I approached the review.
Even that discussion, that isn't talked about as much as on the male side, the use of boy and the first name for Black African-American men in the South at that time. But we don't think as often about what that meant for girls and for women. It's interesting that you talk about those streams of migration, because in your own book, In the Warmth of Other Suns, you have this great part where, as you're telling the story of three different individuals who migrated from the South to the North over the course of the 20th century, you talk about different streams that followed the train lines, followed the bus lines from the South up to the North. And I'm curious, how typical was the trajectory of the Shields and the Robinsons, the two branches of Michelle Obama's family, in making their way north, and their experience on getting to Chicago?
Well, primarily there were three streams of the migration, one up the East Coast from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia up to Washington and Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York up the East Coast. And there was a Midwest stream, which was from Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, the entire Midwest. And then there was the West Coast stream from Texas and Louisiana out to California and beyond, and Washington State and even Alaska. So on a maternal side, that they followed the trajectory that would have been expected for people who happen to be in that state, the state of Alabama. They would generally go straight north. Her paternal side is quite interesting because her grandfather actually took a different route from South Carolina. Instead of going up to New York, he went out to Chicago. So I think in some ways that reflects to me a kind of breaking from the tradition or being more independent, striking out in a way that's different from everyone else. And I'd like to believe that adds an element of independence and adventurousness to that side of her family. It's lovely, though, that when she went to Princeton, she had an aunt or a great aunt who was in New Jersey, literally following the stream that would have been expected from South Carolina, which is where her paternal side had come from. And she says that she would go and visit with her and have somewhat quiet dinners with the food from the old country, cornbread and the greens and that sort of thing. And that it wasn't so much anything that the great aunt said, it was her presence, the reminder of that history, the reminder of where they had all come from. This is a woman who had followed the actual trajectory, as I said, of the migration stream up the East Coast. And so that was a nice grounding, I think, for her when she got to Princeton. It's interesting that for many African Americans, particularly those who are of the generation that she would be from, wherever you would go, you might find that there are people in the big cities of the North and West. You might find that there are people who came through some stream of the Great Migration that your family knows because they fanned out all over the country. And so I thought that was a lovely connection for her in a somewhat isolating space of Princeton, as she describes it, as a place where she had to learn to be one of the few of her kind on that campus. But she had this grounding there with the great aunt who had come from the South.
One of the great things about your review is the way that you connect Michelle Obama's personal story and her family story to that greater history in the U.S. of the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And I want to pivot to your book. What I didn't know, because I hadn't read the book yet, when we assigned you this review, is that on page 10 of your book, The Warmth of Other Suns, you actually make a reference to Michelle Obama and the way her story plays into this larger history of African Americans in this country. We're just going to play a quick clip from the audiobook version of your book.
The story of the Great Migration is among the most dramatic and compelling in all chapters of American history, the Mississippi historian Neil McMillan wrote toward the end of the 20th century. So far-reaching are its effects, even now, that we scarcely understand its meaning. Its imprint is everywhere in urban life. The configuration of the cities as we know them, the social geography of black and white neighborhoods, the spread of the housing projects as well as the rise of a well-scrubbed black middle class, along with the alternating waves of white flight and suburbanization, all of these grew directly or indirectly from the response of everyone touched by the Great Migration. So, too, rose the language and music of urban America that sprang from the blues that came with the migrants and dominates our airwaves to this day. So, too, came the people who might not have existed, or become who they did, had there been no Great Migration. People as diverse as James Baldwin and Michelle Obama, Miles Davis and Toni Morrison, Spike Lee and Denzel Washington, and anonymous teachers, store clerks, steelworkers, and physicians were all products of the Great Migration. They were all children whose life chances were altered because a parent or grandparent had made the hard decision to leave.
So clearly her story is part of this greater history, this larger history. I want to talk a little bit about The Warmth of Other Suns, which came out in 2010, but I know you are still touring the country and the world speaking about this book. As I told you before we started our conversation on this podcast, this book, I'm reading it right now. I'm only on page 185, but it is a wonder not only in terms of the subject matter, but also in the way that you chose to tell this story through three individuals and this constant, the way that you structure it, homing in on the individual stories and then pulling back and having these intervals in which you describe what's happening in the country as a whole at that time. I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you decided to tell the story in The Warmth of Other Suns.
Well, thank you for your kind comments. I knew that this was this huge undertaking. I mean, you're talking about 6 million people who migrated out of the Jim Crow South to all points north, Midwest, and West from the time of World War I until the 1970s. It's massive. And I wanted to tell this story, but I wanted it to be something that would be, that people would want to pick up and stick with, that they would feel themselves in this story somehow. And so I knew that I wanted to have three protagonists, one person to represent each of the streams of this great migration, as I indicated, the East Coast stream, Midwest, and out to the West Coast. And I knew that I wanted to be able to have people that were truly broad and relatable and complex in a way, in a human way that we could all identify with. In other words, I needed people who were admittedly flawed, but trying to do the best that they could. And that meant that I ended up having to interview over 1,200 people. I did this kind of a casting call. I auditioned people for the role of being in this book. I was in New York. I was in Chicago. I was in Milwaukee, Oakland, Los Angeles, interviewing people, talking with them and hearing their stories so that I could narrow it down to these three people. And I chose them because I wanted to have a range of personalities, a range of circumstances that they were in as they were about to leave. I wanted them to have three different precipitating events that set them on their course so that we would be able to see the range and scope of this migration through their eyes. it's written as narrative nonfiction. So when people see that it's 600 pages, they get often intimidated at just looking at it. And then once they get into it, they realize it's a narrative. It's really the story of these three people, and it's with the history woven into it so that it's more easily digestible. And once they get into it, they actually find that it goes so very fast. And that's one of the beauties of narrative nonfiction. It could be long, but if it's written in a way that's engaging and is character-driven, it keeps you as deeply held as a novel could. And so that's the approach that I took to telling this story.
Well, as a reader, I have to say, you cycle through these three stories, and each time you leave one of them, and the three characters are real-life characters, George Swanson Starling, Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, and Ida Mae Brendan Gladney. You leave us on these cliffhangers. It's like, and then he knew he had to run. And then it goes switches to another story. So it really does read like it is a page turner. First of all, the memory of these three individuals is remarkable. And I'm just curious, it's a feat of reporting, because you must have talked not only to them, but then also other people in their lives. And how easy was it to settle on these three people and to get their stories?
I had narrowed it down to about 30. Any one of those 30 out of the 1,200 could have been the three. And then I made the decision based upon the fact that each of them had a really distinctive personality. I mean, when you're on the page with Ida Mae, you know you're on her page. When you're on the page of George Swanson Starling, you know you're on that page. And then when you're with Dr. Foster, of course, it goes without saying that you know you're on his page. So I wanted them to be truly distinctive so that that would do some of the work of a narrative in itself. What was really important to me is that the people had a sense of humor, which is why I connected to some aspects, particularly of Michelle Obama's memoir, the sense of the humor, because almost everything I write, there has to be a sense of humor for me. I think that it allows for a range of emotion for the reader. And there's some really tough, heartbreaking aspects of this book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and there needed to be a sense of humor and some wit to allow a break in the tension that is necessary in a work that's dealing with this topic. So I chose those three people on the basis of the fact that was coming through and as they were telling their stories to me. Also, one thing is that I was focused on the very things that people would be most likely to remember. Those touchstones of your life where you have a really tough decision to make. How did you choose the college that you went to? How did you meet, your spouse? Those kinds of things stay with you. And those were, in fact, the very things that I was interested in. I mean, I didn't need them to remember every single thing that they did on the last job that they had. I wanted to hear the sweep of the major decision of their lives, which was how they got out of the South. And that was what it was based on. And there are people who actually, are really wonderful storytellers. And I loved sitting with all of them. For many of the people who survived the tyranny and the terror of the Jim Crow South, which most Americans really, we don't learn about this. We really don't know what happened in our own country. We really, truly don't. We've seen the water fountains and the signs of the restrooms, and that becomes sort of a tiny peek at what we might think it was like. But that actually, if it were only that, I don't think there would have been a great migration. I don't think that they would have left us on the basis of that. It was the total and complete authoritarian, totalitarian repression that they experienced, which is there for anyone to know if you go into the archives and look at the newspapers of the time. It's very apparent, but you have to go in and look at it. And so I think that, the idea of these people leaving in the way that they did and suffering all that they did, and then also I should say not speaking about it. That's another thing, is that people did not talk about it. The vast majority of people who go through any kind of trauma like this, whether it's war or attempted genocide or this kind of repression, they often don't speak of it to their children and their grandchildren. And in the case, these people did not. And this was a chance for them to unburden themselves in a safe space with me, those who spoke to me. And then for those who read it, it provides them a sense of of closure, meaning, and validation for what they had suffered.
There might be interesting generational responses to the book, because one of the things that I hear from people is that this book changed their life and that it changed their entire vision of the country. And I think that points to what you said earlier about the fact that this history, and I don't know, I think it's gotten somewhat better, but is just not taught, or was just not taught. I grew up in public school, going to public school in New York. And essentially what you learned was that the Civil War ended and the carpetbaggers came down to the South, and then sort of segregation continued. You didn't really hear about Reconstruction and then the institution or the reinstitution of those kind of Jim Crow laws. And then it sort of continued up until the Civil Rights Movement came along. And that's sort of it. And so all of that history and those developments between the Civil War and World War II and its effects on African Americans is basically just glided over and oversimplified. And I thought what was so interesting about your choice of characters is that each of them in a different way defies our stereotypical vision of what an African-American life was like at that time, that Pershing was a doctor at a time when he couldn't actually practice in the local hospital, and that George, I thought one of the great things about the book is that you home in on these little details, that first of all, his life in Central Florida, about just how terrible Florida was. We sort of think of Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama perhaps as the worst, but I don't know if there's any way of possibly saying which was the absolute worst, but Florida was pretty bad. And the detail of what it was like to pick citrus fruit at that time and the economics of sharecropping, it's just startling. And then Ida May, of course, who was, a very strong woman for her time, very independent, like growing up not a typical Southern girl, to say the least.
Yeah.
Did you do that on purpose, or is that's just the way it is and we don't learn about it, or is it that came out as you began to do your in-depth interviews?
Well, to your first point about what we're taught in school, I was taught the same thing as you, and I agree that you have the Civil War. There's a brief, sentence or so about Reconstruction, carpetbaggers and all that, and then you skip over to basically World War II happens, and then there's the Civil Rights Movement. There's Rosa Parks, and those are hitting the points that become a compressed version of many, many millions of lives that get lost in that storyline. And this is, to me, seminal, liminal phase in our country's history that just does not get told. There's not enough attention paid to it. And yet it is sort of it's the foundation of so much of what we see in the cities, the redlining and the restrictive covenants and the social geography of who lives where. All were the result of the Great Migration. The redlining and the restrictive covenants were created as the people were arriving in large numbers, a way to contain and control them. But to your second point about the people who are the characters in this book, the protagonists in this book, I think that in our focus, the way that the stories about African Americans are often told historically in this country is that we often end up looking at the extremes. We look at the extremes that may not be representative of the whole. And that became so clear to me when I was interviewing these, going around the country interviewing these people for this book. I mean, the vast, vast majority of them had been married, and many of them were widowed by the time I met them. That goes against the stereotype that people might have of African Americans. The vast majority of them had been working in something that was, working class, but solid and doing their best, able to save and often send their children to college, even though they might not have been able to go to. It was very common. I mean, they were actually not that unusual. Dr. Foster, of course, was, because he was a physician. That would be unusual for any population. But, all the others were, fit in that range. They were not extreme in any way. They were kind of average. The purpose of interviewing and talking to so many people was to be able to get a gauge as to what the population was like, what had they been through. And there had been so many through lines with all of their stories, as they told me, that the people that I interviewed became sort of my tour guides to the era. Even if they didn't make it in the book, they're in the book, their spirit and energy and the confidence that they gave me to be able to go forward and make the statements that I did. You mentioned Florida. I went back to the places that all of these people were from. I spent time in Louisiana and in Mississippi. I actually went back with Ida Mae to Mississippi, where she had grown up, where she had been picking cotton as a sharecropper's wife. And I went to Florida with George Starling many, many times. There was a tremendous amount of research that was required to fill in the blanks, validate, and to build upon the things that they told me. So it's very, very rich. And, it took me 15 years. I often say if it were a human being, it'd be in high school and dating. That's how long it took me to write this book.
All right. I have to ask you one last question then. Are you working on another book?
I am working on another project. I do not speak about anything related to it, because I learned from the first book that every time you speak about something that you're working on, there's a little bit of energy that exits from your psyche that should be devoted back to the project. So.
Well, that is very good advice. That's a very good counsel, but I do hope that we have you back, if not before then, certainly when that book comes out, to talk about it. Isabel, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's been delightful to talk with you. Thank you.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Helen Schulman joins us now. Her new novel is called Come With Me. Helen, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to start with the very end of your book, in a way. It's an author's note or an afterword. And the first line in that author's note is, "My fears about an obsession with the internet have no bounds." Why is that in this book?
Because this book really is about the way the internet has changed our lives. I mean, so much of what happens in it happens in Silicon Valley, and it sort of permeates the place, the setting of Silicon Valley permeates the family house. There's a teenage son who has a girlfriend who lives in Texas, but she eats dinner with them over Skype. Everybody's texting. It's kind of invasive and scary. The major premise in the book is that this young man, who is the mother's college roommate's son, is also her boss. He's a junior at Stanford. He lives in the entrepreneurial dorm. And he thinks he's found an algorithm to help you to access your multiverses.
So the novel also has a very interesting structure. You focus it on 3 days, non-consecutive days. Why did you decide to do that? Tell a story that way.
I think it's more pragmatics from how I work, which is I need to really structure a novel before I go in. Mm-hmm. And I had certain things I want to have happen on those days, and it was too large, the subject matter, for them to be consecutive. So they take place over 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. But they're very vitally important days in the life of the family.
Can you talk a little bit more about that process? You said you need to know the kind of overall structure of the book. Some people will start having no idea where they're going and work consecutively, but it sounds like you kind of have a plan.
Well, I'm in the middle of that. I mean, I start with something, I have no idea where it's going, but then at a certain point, I have to figure out what kind of form it's going to take. So this one has 3 parts, 3 different days. Each part has 6 different chapters. They're narrated by 4 different people. I mean, it was a lot to handle. And it took place in Silicon Valley and in Fukushima and in Dallas in the present, and in New York and San Francisco in the past. So it was kind of a lot to handle.
That makes it sound very complicated.
I don't think it's nearly as complicated when you read it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had to explain to my editor the form that I took. She didn't notice it. That's good.
What was the starting point?
At the time, I wanted to write about a Sheryl Sandberg-like character. Now I do not want to write about Sheryl Sandberg. I'm pretty angry at Sheryl Sandberg. But
why did you want to write about her?
Well, we had visited Google early on. Mm-hmm. My husband grew up on Stanford campus, and he went to Stanford, and he had a friend from there a female engineer who was working at Google, and she asked us to come. She invited us to come have lunch and bring the kids, and I was stunned. This is before people really knew what Google was like, at least on the East Coast, and they weren't here. And everything was taken care of for you. You could drop off your dry cleaning and get your shoes shod. You could have 8 different breakfasts, and you could take gym classes, and there were pods for sleeping in, and there were places where people could play with Lego and play chess, and they had crash units, like apartments if you stayed all night. So really everything was designed so that you would never leave, but also you're a little bit infantilized because you don't have to make any decisions.
What did you think? Like, what was your gut reaction? This is great, or this is terrifying, or something in between, or?
It's always something in between for me. I'm pretty much, I'm interested in the gray material between black and white. Mm-hmm. It looked fun. I know it was, based on a campus, but I do think that kind of enclosure, that life is probably not good for people.
So you went to Google and you wanted to write about Sheryl Sandberg, and that was sort of the genesis of the novel.
Yeah, not her particularly, but I like the idea of this older woman, quote unquote, having to be sort of like a mother executive to all these baby geniuses who are totally out of control.
How does Fukushima play into this?
I was so fascinated with it. I couldn't shake it. I just did a lot of research on it. That's what happens. I get just so obsessed with something. And I went to this art show by a photographer who had gone there into the no-go zone. And that fascinated me. And Dan is a character. He's a out-of-work journalist who's long lost his beat. And I thought, wow, let me give him my obsession.
And he is the husband of Amy, your protagonist. The genius, the sort of third main character here, he has come up with some kind of algorithm to calculate the multiverse, which was a new term to you. It might be new to some of our listeners. What is the multiverse?
So I don't know how many people have seen Sliding Doors, that old movie with Gwyneth Paltrow, but that was an example of it. It's something that both poets and physicists, have played around with, and some really believe it's true, that we're living out our lives on infinite other multiverses. And so the decisions that we make change in these different multiverses, and therefore you can have a very different kind of life. And so it was really funny. I was actually reading the Times at the time when I got the idea, and there was an article about how software engineers were going to science fiction to get their ideas because they had this great instrument, but they didn't know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, if I had that instrument, what would I do? And I thought, wow, I'd really like to know what would have happened if I had done this or done that.
I'm glad that you brought up Sliding Doors, because I think it's one of those movies that, it wasn't necessarily a great movie, and yet it's had this afterlife as this constant reference point.
Like Groundhog Day.
Yes, but Groundhog Day was a really good movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating once you open that up, all of the possibilities that you can entertain. But one thing I think is fascinating about the concept is, in a way, isn't it already happening? I mean, when you have with the internet, for example, if you do break up with a boyfriend, he's still out there. You can see the life that he's living. You can sort of more readily imagine what might have happened had you been with him. It's like we're already confronted with all of these possibilities because you see your former workplace and your former colleagues online, and you can you're in constant confrontation with these earlier lives that you led in a way that I don't think people were before.
No, that's absolutely true. But I think this is taking it to the nth degree. She doesn't know. Donnie doesn't know. Nobody knows if any of this is true. It's all wacky, but it's anchored by math and physics. I mean, you can approximate, but you don't know. You don't know what would have happened if you walked left instead of right. You just don't. So, and look, I mean, I am at a certain age where you're thinking about the major decisions of your life, like where you live and what you do for work and which friendships you kept. And so this is a way to find that out.
Do you kind of explore that? Do you feel like as a writer, you're exploring those ideas through fiction?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, for me, multiverse theory was a relief to hear about it because as a fiction writer, I have all these stories in my head and characters in my head all the time that are playing in the background while I'm living my life and stopping and getting groceries. And, sometimes it feels almost crazy. And so this multiverse, when I read this book by Max Tegmark about multiverse theory, I thought, oh, that's what it is. That's what being a fiction writer is. It's imagining other possibilities.
So that as you're going about your own daily life, you have these other characters kind of populating your mind and your imagination and hearing their voices as you go about making breakfast.
I mean, it's not quite as... I don't think I'm hearing voices, quote unquote.
You're not crazy.
But yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. But sometimes it's, it can begin to, especially when you're really deep into a novel, it can interfere with your being present in your present life because it's very captivating.
And what about when you finish the novel? Are the voices or the characters still there? Or do you still find yourself thinking like, well, what would have this character said or thought about this?
Honestly not. I mean, I never reread my books. I just move on to the next. And when you're put out a book, people ask you to give readings and they might interview you if you're lucky, like I am today with you. And so you have to kind of keep it fresh. But once that's gone, I just say goodbye. So sometimes my students or something will quote something to me and I think, did I write that? I just let it go.
They're dead to you now.
Yeah, no, it's like the Stan Mandela. It's not dead to me, but it's past.
Well, I'm going to make you reread a little bit. Would you read a passage from
Sure.
Come With Me?
Okay, so this is I'm going to read the first page. This is the opening of the book. It was a cool blue morning. Later at dawn, which was coming too fast, Amy wasn't ready yet to face the day. Sunlight would layer the sky into swaths of paler blues, grays, pinks. But not now. Now the whole world, or at least her ludicrously perfect patch of it, was encased in a clear, inky gel, an atmospheric snow globe seemingly flawless. Amy had just been awakened by a tactile hallucination, sensing her phone vibrating minutes before the alarm actually was set to go off. She grabbed it from her nightstand, saving Dan that juddering, hand-buzzery sound, a gag that came daily, like Uncle God's worn-out prank. These days, her nights comprise marathon hours of lacy sleep, in and out of dreams so wild and disturbing. The interruption by her own inner alarm clock could be viewed less as a textbook case of conditioning, Pavlov's wake-up call, and more accurately as an act of self-preservation. She moved Dan's open laptop carefully off his belly, closed it, and set it down onto the cream-colored cut pile carpeting on her side of the bed. Dan must have fallen asleep while updating his LinkedIn file. Back in the day when he first started out in newspapers, he often conked out while writing on yellow legal pads, and Amy had to pry the pens out of his hand. The attic still held several ink-stained coverlets documenting that period, time capsules. So last century.
And in that very beginning, you already introduced both the couple, obviously, but also this kind of intimate connection with these devices that we all have. That was Helen Schulman reading from Come With Me. Helen, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Alexandra, what's going on?
Hi. So we're in the heat of the holiday season, of course, just days out from Christmas, and publishers are encountering a really unusual problem this year. Every year there's one or two books that are unexpected bestsellers and they run out of stock. One year it was All the Light We Cannot See. It happens every year, but usually it's, painful for the author involved and the publisher involved, but the industry as a whole is unscathed. This year it's a little different. It's a little more widespread, and one of the reasons is that there's been this enormous backlog at the printing presses. And this has been going on for months, but it's just become really visible and acute right now and, right at the holiday shopping season. And part of the reason apparently has to do with, one major printer shut down. So that reduced their capacity. There's going to be a big consolidation probably with the other two printers combining. And on top of that, and this is where it gets kind of funny, good news, bad news, there's just been an enormous spike in demand for hardcovers this year. You've had some huge hits like Michelle Obama's Becoming, Bob Woodward's Fear, which has sold, I think, almost 2 million copies now. Michelle Obama's Becoming sold 2 million copies in the first 2 weeks.
Wow.
So this is keeping the printers running around the clock. And when there's an unexpected demand for, say, a literary novel that made a bunch of 10 best lists, for example, Lisa Halliday's Asymmetry or Washington Black, when they need to go back and do reprints to meet the demand, they're not able to do it. So
what's the trajectory of a book from the printer to the bookstore, and how long does that typically take?
That's a great question. And I just want to clarify something I just said. They are able to do the reprints. It's just taking longer. Mm-hmm. So they have ordered more copies of Asymmetry. They're on their way. Same for the Frederick Douglass biography by David Blight, which is also out of stock on Amazon right now, but they're printing more.
These are books that were on our 10 best
Yes.
list.
Publishers are both very delighted and happy to be on the list, but they've been complaining that it's caused a run on their books, which, again, it's an interesting problem to have. So typically publishers tell me it can take, if you need a reprint and you realize stock is running low, it can take 2 to 3 weeks. For these books, some of the books I mentioned, another one is The Overstory by Richard Powers, which was also on a lot of 10 best lists. It was also shortlisted for the Booker. When they went to reprint that, when they realized that stock was getting low, his publisher is Norton, they heard it was going to take 2 to 3 months.
Wow.
So that is the time frame shift that people are dealing with. And so when you're looking at this week where most publishers make up, the bulk of their sales for the year, or certainly booksellers as well, for those particular authors who are affected, it can really mean lost sales, because if you're going to get that book as a gift, you're not going to wait until January. If you're buying it for yourself, you'll certainly buy it at some point. And I'm sure these are novels that I think are building by word of mouth and hand selling by independents. So I do think they'll have a longer shelf life than some of the things that burn out more quickly that are tied to the news cycle. It does result in lost sales. And so authors are very concerned. Agents are absolutely panicking. And, publishers, the impact is ongoing. I mean, many of them are now looking at moving early January, February titles back a few weeks, because now they can't ensure that they'll have enough copies to go on sale when those books publish.
We've been getting a lot of emails from publishers at the Book Review letting us know that books have been moved back. The pub date has been moved back by exactly that, 2-3 weeks.
Yeah. And so, in most cases, if it's like a debut novel, it shouldn't have a huge impact. But in some cases, if they have media planned around it, a big interview somewhere, or, the monthly magazines are planning to run a review, you really don't want to miss, your on sale, your pub date if you have media planned, because you need the book to be available. So
how does the hierarchy work in terms of what gets to go first on the printing presses? Like, is it, Michelle Obama, Bob Woodward, those kind of, because they're selling in such huge numbers, there's so much power there are so many retailers and publishers that are invested in it, that those would then sort of take precedent over books that might be smaller and still need to be printed?
No one has put it in exactly those terms. I think maybe because it could create some hard feelings. But I mean, if you just sort of look at what's out of stock and what isn't, you can sort of make that assumption. And of course, you're weighing demand from retailers when you're making these decisions. And when publishers are all sort of competing for time on the printing presses, they're going to have to make those decisions probably based on demand, I would assume.
What's going on with the printer business? Like, why is this a problem?
So this is interesting. I think it's been building for a couple of years. And I think one thing is they were having issues with paper prices and paper shortages earlier in the year. And then it just wasn't thought to be like a big growth industry, of course, paper. For a long time, ebooks were ascendant, print sales were falling, the magazine industry is like almost just collapsing. So it didn't look like a place where you would want to invest a lot of money in infrastructure and open up new plants. People were sort of running, just kind of maintaining what they needed to. And anytime there was consolidation, for example, a big printer would buy another printer, they would shut plants and sort of try to make more money that way. So they're shrinking a bit.
To lower their operating costs.
Yeah. And then when you have this surprising reversal that we've had just in the last, few years, where print sales are actually, first they're stabilizing, then now they're growing, ebook sales are falling. Publishers are thrilled about that, and so are booksellers. But the printing companies aren't necessarily seeing this as a time to invest. Wall Street's not pouring money into them saying, yeah, go out and open up a big new plant. They're sort of riding it out. And so you're having, I think, just a demand issue now.
Where are most printers in the United States? I mean, assuming that most printing still takes place here. I know a lot of it is in China and Singapore for children's books, for art books.
For the more elaborate illustrated books, cookbooks, that takes place overseas in China a lot of the time. But there's still a pretty healthy industry in the U.S., and particularly for just your sort of run-of-the-mill hardcover and paperbacks. The real bottleneck seems to be in hardcovers. And one of the things I've heard from publishers, and I'm hoping to learn more about this from the printers themselves, is that you need people to work on these binding lines to bind the hardcovers. And they haven't. It's been harder to staff them to get additional workers because the unemployment rate is so low.
All right, last question. For those of us who want to buy that great best-selling hardcover for the holidays for an aunt or a parent or whoever it might be, where do you encounter this problem? Is it the independents that are running out of books? Is it Amazon? Is it Barnes & Noble? Is this just sort of spread across the board?
So interestingly, the independents seem to have prepared for this in some ways better than the bigger chains, perhaps because they're more in touch with their customer base. People are coming in daily asking for things, and they're sort of more in tune with what they're expecting to be popular in the holidays. And many of them, I talked to, the head of the American Booksellers Association, which is an organization that sort of oversees independents. And I heard that, they kind of saw this coming or a few months ago, and many of them have planned for it. I would say if you really want that hardcover, check with your independent. And also publishers have said, and they're very clear on this, that the Amazon window, when they tell you it's going to ship in 1 to 2 months, they want to under-promise and over-deliver. So often it can actually come sooner than that once the stock comes in. So keep checking if that is your preferred way. And as well as on Barnes & Noble, if you look on their website, it might say it's out of stock. But if you go to your local store, they very well might have it there.
All right. Well, this is kind of bad news that's sort of good news,
Yes,
right?
exactly. That's what makes it such an interesting story. It's obviously devastating for authors who right now are hearing from readers that want to buy their book and it's not available. On the other hand, you're seeing not just the big books selling this year, the ones that were expected to be hits, but these, smaller novels, literary fiction is selling really well right now. So that's all great.
Go out and buy books, people.
Yes.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, Tina Jordan, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, John. What are you reading?
I'm going to mention 2 things. I'll be quick. The first is a very short book that I read in about an hour and a half one night a couple of weeks ago called Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. She's an Argentine writer, and this is her first book translated into English. I think it came out last year, Tina? Last year?
Early last year, even
Or
the year
late,
before, yeah.
And it's a very bizarre book. It is quite literally, it's called Fever Dream, and it's almost like having a dream reading it because you're not entirely sure the whole time who exactly is talking and when. It's a woman who is clearly, very ill and is having a conversation with a young boy who may or may not be in the room with her. And you sometimes see his sort of prompts in italics, and then the rest is her recounting what you're not sure what kind of an event it was, but obviously something happened that sort of poisoned the people and animals of a town. And I think essentially, not to spoil it, I think there's an obvious environmental allegory here. But the experience of reading the book is kind of abstract and very heart rate increasing. There's a sense of just ominous menace, like what's around the next corner and what exactly we're going to learn about this situation. And I really enjoyed that. And she has a collection of short stories coming out next month for people who enjoyed Fever Dream. And then I wrote a review this week of a short book called The Word Pretty by Elisa Gabbert, who is someone whose work I know from the internet. She's on Twitter a lot, and she writes for various online magazines, so she's sending links to her work pretty regularly. And this collection, which, as I say in the review, is really pretty itself. It's got a really nice design. It fits in your pocket really easily. And it's very casual. It reminds me in some ways of the best qualities of blogs, which I find myself missing more and more weirdly now. It's a very conversational voice, a lot about reading, a lot about sort of geeky enthusiasm about things in books like translator's notes or, why she sometimes wants to read translated literature instead of literature in English. And
why?
Well, that's a good question. She especially suggests reading this novel called A Heart So White by Javier Marias. This is a favorite book of hers. And when she writes about it, she says that sometimes she's just in the mood partly to get away from the hype machine of English language literature and all the books that we're talking about. She said Knausgaard and Ferrante are exceptions to this rule. And then she says also the structures of translated novels, the sentence patterns, the symbols and themes may be common or even cliche in their countries of origin, but I'm less exposed to them, so they feel fresh and unexpected to me. Perhaps most importantly, for fiction and translation to work, the interest can't all be in quote-unquote perfect or beautiful sentences, since the words and rhythm and syntax will all be different in the new language. Lovely still, one hopes, but not in the same way. Instead, other elements, the ideas, the characters, the story, have to carry across. These other elements are constructed from language, but are less subject to corruption or erosion through translation, which I thought was a very elegant way of putting it. Mm-hmm. She's also got this very funny, speaking of translation, she has this funny sort of factoid about how Kafka's Metamorphosis is difficult to translate into Japanese because of what she calls the culture's insect product appreciation, which means that, the Japanese don't maybe find it as disgusting to wake up as a bug as they would. So it's just full of delightful little nuggets like that. Tina, what about you? What are you reading?
So I'm reading The Day That Went Missing by novelist Richard Beard, which I picked up after reading our review, which was by Lisa Brennan-Jobs, the author of Small Fry.
And Beard is a novelist, but this is a memoir.
Right. He's a novelist. This is a memoir, and he's in his 50s, and he's having all kinds of emotional troubles. He's on the brink of divorce, and he's starting to wonder if maybe what he's suffering from is some kind of repressed trauma, because 40 years before, in 1978, when his family was on vacation in Cornwall at the beach, he and his little brother went swimming, and his brother drowned next to him in the waves. His brother was 9, and he was 11.
It's not like he didn't know that happened. You say repressed trauma, but it...
Well, the thing is, he doesn't remember anything of the day when he starts out. And this is, like, you're reading the book, it's shocking. So he goes back in time to try to piece together what actually happened that day and what happened in the aftermath. And one of the first things he discovered, and this blew me away, was that after they went home to bury his brother, they came back to the beach a day or two later because they had a lease to finish out their family vacation.
Wow.
And so he keeps asking questions, much in the way that Brennan-Jobs did in Small Fry, where she had to go back in time and piece things together and, repressed memories
kind
are
of fact
tough,
check her
right?
own life.
Fact check her own life. He's doing the same thing, but, he's looking at the police reports, the hospital reports. There's this moment where he's talking to his mother, who sort of always presented his brother in later years as a ne'er-do-well, like the problem kid of the family. Yet when he goes to look at his brother's school records, he finds that Nicky was, in fact, the brightest of all of them, a star student, a star athlete. So
his mom was kind of
she was
the
embroidering
sour grapes philosophy of parenting.
Well, I think
the kid she couldn't have turned out to be the bad kid.
Right. That's how she coped, by embroidering this story around this child who died. And there was so much of that in the family, and you start to see how they just eliminated this child from the story of the family.
You're really selling this book to me. I'm like, I have to grab a copy.
But you know what? He's a novelist. Beard is a novelist, and it shows. Do you know how some nonfiction almost reads like a novel? Mm-hmm. Like, this is one of those books. But it's also incredibly moving. And the end where he returns to the beach where this happened is just incredibly moving.
You're making me want to read his fiction, too, and see how much of this story is kind of filtered into that.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't even thought of that. That is a really great idea.
Have you read his novels?
I haven't. Now, Greg's right. Now I should.
It's maybe something he tried to process first through storytelling and then finally had to confront in like a journalism kind of memoir format.
Right, even if he didn't realize it.
Yeah.
Greg, you're doing food processing this week.
It's a nice transition, John. I am reading a book. I'm rereading a book that I often read at this time of year as kind of family descends and you start planning for as you start planning for entertaining. It is a memoir by Laurie Colwin, also a novelist who wrote some memoirs. It's called Home Cooking, A Writer in the Kitchen. This is the kind of memoir that our colleague Elida Becker calls a foodwar, which is to say that it is a culinary memoir and really told in essays about separate culinary topics, each one concluding with a recipe that illuminates what she's just been writing about. And through it, you get a picture of Laurie Colwin's life. Laurie Colwin died young of cancer back in the late 80s or early 90s. This book came out in 1988. And as a novelist and as a memoirist, she was very charming and effervescent, just a very companionable writer, very good at the kind of throwaway aphorism or the quick aside that nails something. And in this book, she's funny on kitchen disasters and on cooking in a tiny, tiny apartment in Greenwich Village in her youth. What she's doing has become so familiar as a genre that it doesn't feel as if she's breaking new ground into this. And of course, she's also doing what, MFK Fisher did before her. But it's so fun that you go along for the ride. And also what she's doing, it feels familiar now, but at the time, in a way, John, it's like what you said about Alyssa Gabbert. There's something very bloggish about this, and a lot of this genre has been subsumed now into food blogs, the Pioneer Woman, that kind of thing. People writing about their domestic life, their cooking life, and then supplementing it with recipes. And there are, I think of people like Kate Christensen, another novelist who's written food memoirs in this style.
Do you cook, or is this sort of what's the word I'm looking for?
Surrogate.
Yes.
I do cook. I don't do most of the cooking in my family. My wife is home before I am and cooks during the week. But sort of as a trade-off for that, to let her off the hook on weekends, and also just because I really enjoy it, I cook on weekends. Almost always I do the cooking. During the week, she cooks and I clean.
You read a cleaning memoir next. I've never read Colwyn, but I know a lot of people have a ton of affection for her.
Oh, I do.
Yeah, she is completely charming.
Pamela, what are you reading this week?
Well, I'm reading, as listeners now know, Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. So rather than talk about that, which I think I'll probably still be reading next week, and we'll talk again about it later, I'll talk about one book that I read in between for my book club. This is my Kidlit book club. We only read books for children, and listeners of this podcast will know that I last attempted to read Rudyard Kipling's Kim for that club, which I did not finish. The next choice, we tend to we cycle between classic, modern, and contemporary. So the next choice is a contemporary novel by Laurie Halse Anderson called Speak, which it's not new. It came out, I think, in the early 90s. And Laurie Halse Anderson is a really interesting writer. She is probably best known for her historical fiction, award-winning historical fiction. She did a trilogy called the Seeds of America trilogy around the Revolutionary War, and those books were called Forge, Chains, and Ashes. But she also does very contemporary books, Winter Girls, which deals with anorexia, and Speak, which is really, I'm giving away this story, but I think it's well known, is the account of a girl who, a first-hand account by a narrator who's in high school and is clearly suffering from depression, and we don't know why until towards the end of the book, and it turns out that she has been raped. And what's interesting about this book, which is still widely read in schools today, is that Laurie Halse Anderson herself was raped at this age, that this experience that she writes about fictionally in the book really mirrored in many ways her own personal experience. And she has a new book coming out early next year called Shout, which is a memoir told in verse that is about her own experience.
You say told in verse. Is Speak also told in verse?
No, Speak is written in an almost diaristic first-person narrative. It's very spare, and it's a short book, and yet, even though I think it's a very good book, it's almost a grueling reading experience because you're reading from the perspective of someone who is depressed, seriously depressed. And so you can, as a reader, become frustrated or tired of that character without knowing. And I think that's all very deliberate and smart on the author's part, but knowing why she is this way until you get to that reveal towards the end. So that's what I'm reading.
Has the club met to discuss it yet?
We did meet, yes.
Because I feel like the club as a whole wasn't crazy about Rudyard Kipling.
I would say that the club was crazy about it in the sense that it made them crazy.
Right.
They were both very interesting book club conversations. Anyway, thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.